So thank you for having me. And I will start with a little disclaimer that I think one thing when we dove into this research, which was with my collaborator, Karen Renaud, and she actually spoke at the UK Impact, is we try to be really careful. You know, when you start going into religion, it's very sensitive. And I'd say we entered it with the utmost respect with all religions in multiple ways. And really, we try to do it just to learn as much as we could and to see what we could learn and how we could take that and apply it to cybersecurity. And, you know, I think one of the big challenges we see with cybersecurity, and a lot of this just isn't new, but the importance continues to grow. And the attention and focus does as well. You know, when I first went into cybersecurity, yeah, people knew about it. They knew it was a thing. You know, it's continuing to grow in importance, but even more so now. So when people say, "Oh, what do you do?" You know, say cybersecurity, like, "Oh, that's a good field. That's so important." I'm like, yeah. But you know, I think what's quite disconcerting at this point is, yeah, as it continues to grow, the solutions and stuff aren't keeping up with it. Right, and we just keep falling more and more behind, and so you know whatever we're doing just isn't working enough, and so we need to continue, I think, to kind of look at different ways where we can learn from other disciplines, learn from other ways of doing things, and that's kind of what set us out to look at. Well, maybe looking at other disciplines or other areas that have seen success. And, you know, looking at something like religion that has been successful as an institution for thousands of years, maybe there's something there to learn from. And, you know, even looking apart from the faith aspect of it, but as an institution, what components of it causes it to be successful, right? You know, and some of those main aspects that we found from that were kind of these three main components. This you know, believing, belonging, and doing, these three kind of dimensions. We're going to talk more about this as we dive into some of the literature. When I say literature, I'm not going to actually dive into the individual aspects. I don't want you all to run out of here that quickly. But some of the things we learn from it, really. And, you know, I'd say, and, you know, here's some of the things as we think about religion. And some of you maybe grew up going to church. I grew up going to church to some extent, you know, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But here's some of what some people see in some religious institutions that maybe they went to. Some art, just as an example, right? Some representations of what maybe they see or saw, you know. And sometimes art can be kind of pleasing. It can kind of be calming, right? And again, this is just one representation of religion. Okay, and here's some other representations of being together, togetherness, as we see in religious institutions. Now, here on the left, that might represent like a mass. Okay, on the right, maybe that's just more obvious. A lot of food, a potluck. Okay. Now, I have a lot of memories of potlucks. That's a lot of food there, and my mom, she's a good cook. Okay. Now, what I remember about a potluck is looking around there and realizing that, you know, trying to find something good and knowing that probably none of that food was going to be as good as my mom's food. But you know, knowing that, but still knowing that really wasn't the point. The point being there was being around other people there, and hopefully some of my friends there at the same age would be there and having fun, but being together. And that was kind of the point. Again, that togetherness. Okay. Maybe for some other people, they're like that was the best food they were going to get for a while. I don't know. So, you know, I think one of the things that was a lot of fun about this research, and I don't say this about all the research I do, to be honest, but this research was a lot of fun. We interviewed religious leaders representing some of the top religions in the world, and you know, we weren't sure what kind of reception we were going to get as we contacted different religious leaders. but we were able to get some people to be like, sure, we'll talk to you, you know. And honestly, it was very fascinating. I kind of felt like I had a baseline level of knowledge of some different religions. And we kind of split up the work, and I interviewed, I think, maybe 4 of them. And really, it was just fascinating talking to them and learning about their religion and what they represented and what they would teach to the followers of their religion, and kind of dispelling some of my misconceptions to a certain extent. And you know, it was something that was also humbling in many ways at the same time. So I'm very appreciative, I guess, of the time they gave to us. And we offered compensation to them. Some of them took it, a lot of them didn't. They were just, you know, again, happy to share with them what, you know, their perspective. And a combination of looking through the literature and speaking to these leaders of these top world religions kind of gave us this vision for cybersecurity. And going back to what I was kind of talking about before, this first one of believing and thinking about what maybe it means in cybersecurity, and you know, kind of thinking about, you know, teaching little bits at a time is just one example of this. Now, before I went into academia, I was a trainer for the last couple of years in my prior job. I just mentioned that because I don't want you to think I was just all coming from academia, that I don't have any experience training people or understanding what it's like a little bit. I understand how hard it is to try and reach people. I remember buying a little Jeopardy game thing that actually had actual controllers and trying to do whatever I can to get people's attention. It's not easy. You know, for those of you who have done this in your organization, you know how difficult it can be to try and engage people, right? But just thinking about how this is done from in a lot of religious institutions, kind of break it up into small bits, you know. And for those of you who've been in church, you know the long sermons or the long teachings versus the short ones, how difficult it can be to, you know, pay attention or to stay awake. But how much more effective it can be when you have just these little tidbits versus the much longer, you know, teachings. It's much easier, I think, to grasp onto. And you know, the same is true whether you're talking about a lecture in a class versus you know, a training that's taking place for cybersecurity. Making the message personal, you know. And I think back to, you know, when I remember in college, and I hadn't gone to church in quite a while, but I remember in college, you know, I had some friends that were going to this church, and I'm like, a lot of them were going to. I'm like, okay, I'll check it out. And it was this pastor that was just, you know, he would tell stories, and there were stories that people could relate to, you know, and that's what was driving people to go there, to attend. It didn't really matter so much in some respects what denomination it was or what religion it was, is people were relating to it. You know, when we think about cybersecurity so much, is there's so many layers of abstraction that people deal with that, you know, when you say security or cybersecurity, a lot of times people don't know what that means entirely. You know, it's like maybe we know what that means to some extent, right? Maybe we know what that means. But you think about the average everyday employee, I think that's poses a lot of challenges. But the more we can kind of make it more understandable and personable to them by using messaging that makes sense to them, by using stories that they can relate to, kind of like an effective, you know, messenger from religious institutions are able to do, I think all the more powerful that's going to be, you know, and talking to these religious leaders and talking about how, you know, they seem to be able to relate to people, and when they are effective and how they're able to reach people, that's what they're doing, right? You know, and something I found interesting too in talk, and this isn't universal, and I think the thing about talking to leaders from multiple religions, which was fascinating, there's always could be contradictions. That's why there's so many different religions, right? And that's why there's different denominations and different types within major religions. One example is just encouraging questions. Now, we know not all religions encourage that, but as I was talking to one of these religious leaders, like, you know, we encourage them to question different components of the faith, right? Again, I know that's not true all the time, but I found that interesting, you know, and as I think about cybersecurity, how much do we encourage questions versus how much do we just tell them what it is? Do we allow them to be curious? And when there's curiosity, I think there's a greater chance for people to be interested, to develop understanding, right? I have a 7 and 11-year-old, and I swear my daughter, my 11-year-old, very rarely should she just ask a question. She'll preface it, I have a question. I'm like, okay, you can, what's your question? And I love that they have questions. They're curious kids, they have lots of questions. But I think a lot of times as people get older, they become into adulthood, maybe they just aren't as curious as much, or maybe they're not encouraged enough to ask questions, especially in some domains where maybe they get used to just being talked to or spoken to, you know, especially something like cybersecurity. So I liked hearing that, you know, that they're encouraged in this specific religion to question it, to question components of the faith, not just to ask questions, but to question it, to challenge it to a certain extent. I was like, really? I'm like, that's again, it was something I was familiar with the religion, but I didn't know that aspect of it, you know. So I found that fascinating. I found that enlightening. Again, trying to think as I hear about it, trying to think about how that could apply to cybersecurity, right? And then thinking about this other aspect of belonging and this thing of building community, right? And, you know, when I was, you know, my parents, I stopped going to church a lot when I was younger because my parents divorced, and there was just, my mom was too busy to be able to, like, you know, she's working 2 or 3 jobs, like, to be able to take us to church. But then when I was in middle school, a good friend of mine, he's like, oh yeah, you should come to church with me or whatever. I'm like, why? You know, I'm like, how am I going to do that? And, but he was like, but he was telling me about his youth group and stuff and how much fun it was and things. And, you know, and then I went with him, and it was kind of, I didn't know most of the people, but it was fun, you know, and I think that was part of it is, yeah, there was that religious aspect of it. It wasn't divorced from that religious aspect of it, but there was that other side of it where it was also, you know, that community building, that fun aspect of it. So it wasn't just straight, like, you know, you think about the cybersecurity trainings that I think we've all been through, even maybe apart from being cybersecurity professionals, where maybe it's this computer-based training and you're just trying to get through it. I know I've been through them, and you're like, can't I just try and answer the questions? Why are you making me sit through this? Why is it timed where I can't just go through the end? But if you can think about ways, I guess, to engage people where it's not just all this strict cybersecurity, but other ways to engage them in a sense and build that community, you know, I think, I don't know, I guess, you know, you might have better success of people feeling more comfortable when it comes time for the cybersecurity aspect of it as well. You know, I just, again, thinking back to going to church and youth group, and then talking to these religious leaders and what they do to try and engage people, outside of it just being strictly the religious aspect of it. You know, it just made me think through some of that stuff and ways it could be done with respect to cybersecurity. I kind of found it interesting. You know, working together to support others. You know, you know, you see this in some different religious institutions. You know, for example, I know this is big in Catholicism to a certain extent, where you have a lot of community outreach, and you see this in some other religious institutions too. You know, are we doing that in cybersecurity? Are we making it to such an extent where it's easy for people to feel supported if they have questions or if they make mistakes, right? I mean, I think that's what we talk about more than anything in cybersecurity is people making mistakes. But are they feeling supported? Or are they just feeling, you know, feeling bad about themselves? Or are they feeling like they're gonna get in trouble? What are we doing? What are we doing there, right? And And are we being kind? Are we showing grace? And then finally, I guess on the do aspect of it, you know, are we you know, again going to that grace aspect? Are we demonstrating forgiveness? What kind of routines are we showing or doing to help people become more familiar with what they should be doing from a cybersecurity standpoint? And are we making it easy for them? You know, yeah, there's technical solutions that we maybe can and should be doing more often. But if someone gets, you know, and we'll have a talk later about phishing. I think phishing is probably one of the biggest challenges we face. Are we making it easy for people to ask if this is a phishing email, right? Are we just leaving it up to their judgment and being like, they got to figure it out? You know, it's not easy. I'll tell a really quick story on this is I did some cybersecurity camps for 7th through 12th graders. And on the last day, I do just straight human factors to cybersecurity. And for an hour, I say, okay, you have an hour with your camp counselors to come up with some spear phishing emails. We're on the target. Okay, you get to spear phish me. Okay, I know it's coming. All right, and I consider myself an expert in this area. I know it's coming, and these kids, I want to say these evil little kids, but they are so good. They are so good that some of these emails, I don't know for sure if they are legit or not. I don't know, because they're thinking like an adversary. Again, this is just working with them for an hour or so, talking through it. And then you think about people in the real world where cybersecurity is not their main job. They're just trying to do their actual work. And then they get the spear phishing email from people that have been, you know, doing this for a long time. Like, it's not fair. It's kind of mean, you know. And then here we're being so punitive to them. We're shaming them. We're using all these negative emotions. You know, I guess my point is it's just not right. You know, so are we giving them enough tools to help them do what they need to do to help the organization, to help themselves, to help their peers be more successful in cybersecurity? You know, like successful, I guess, religious institutions and organizations are doing for their people, right? So here's just some examples of cyber art. And I'm not saying cyber art's going to solve any problems here, but we just think about, you know, ways we can try and learn from different aspects of world religions, and ways we can try and normalize some of these abstractions, I think, that we see in cybersecurity that I think pose so many of the challenges, right? Here's another one. I think some of these, my colleague, I think she might have used generative AI maybe to come up with some of these. I don't remember for sure, but it's interesting to think through some of these. And so after we came up with some of these things, we consulted some cybersecurity experts. And some of the things as they looked through that, what they came up with is, you know, think about forgiveness for mistakes, you know, doing the right thing no matter what. And also think about rewards for doing the right thing. You know, I think so many times we're just thinking about punishing people when they don't do the right thing, but what about when they do the right thing, right? And then creating a greater culture of understanding. Because again, mistakes are going to happen. This can happen, you know, example, you know, again, a phishing email, it can happen to anyone, right? Having regular meetings of some kind, you know, these religious institutions, these world religions, that's the thing they all have, right? They have regular meetings, okay? They repeat their teachings at regular intervals. And again, but they do it in such a way that hopefully they make it interesting and engaging enough. Yeah, you keep coming back and wanting more for whatever reasons, okay? Again, I have plenty of disclaimers about world religions, okay? And I'm happy to get into some of those. Some people don't have choices of religion. I totally understand. There was lots of other disclaimers, but for lots of other people, they go there, they find a sense of comfort, or they like what they hear, they like the messaging. What can we do for some more of that in cybersecurity? You know, how can we be more, you know, effective and engaging? Okay. Also realizing that one size doesn't fit all. Okay. And I think it's easy to get into that mentality because we want to find that training in a box. We want to purchase that. We want it to be our solution, knowing that it's probably not going to work well for everyone. Okay. And does the one size fits all work well for everyone in religious institutions? Probably not. Okay. But I think if we talk to people and maybe ask them, what do you like about church, for example? Some people will have different answers, right? Maybe it's the singing, the music. I know for some people that's definitely it. My grandma, she would be watching on TV one of the church services. She was not a religious person at all, but she liked the music. I don't think she cared about anything else, but she liked the music. So rituals and routines. This was another interesting one that, is there more we can do about that in cybersecurity? I know some religions, this was very big, okay? And this is what people would find comfort in it because they knew what to expect, right? And some religions were very big on that. And again, the sense of community and belonging, right? These are some potential higher values, and I think this is one of the big takeaways is, and this is kind of our next step in this research that we're working on now, is thinking about what some of these higher values could be in cybersecurity, and thinking about protecting people, doing the right thing when no one else is watching. Okay, and again, security being everyone's responsibility, right? And I did want to briefly touch on some of these other components real quick, but I did want to also get to, and I've kind of spoken, I think, throughout some practical takeaways, hopefully. Knowing the time I have left, though, I did mention, trying to avoid these negative emotions like fear. My colleague and I, it's kind of our big research area is trying to minimize the use of fear because it's just not really that effective in the long term. It doesn't really build trust within organizations and within people using fear. There's examples I'm happy to talk about one-on-one because we don't have really time now, but Scared Straight and the Baby Doll program. Again, shame, same thing. It may feel, again, some of these negative emotions may feel intuitively like they work. And again, this is also where, religions aren't perfect because some of them use some of these negative emotions, right? We can think about some examples where maybe some of these are used. So it's kind of like take what we can learn, take what maybe is effective, and think about the things that maybe aren't as effective, right? And this is an example of where shame maybe has negative outcomes versus where not using shame can have more positive outcomes. Okay. All credit to my colleague. She loves doing these diagrams. Okay. Regret's an interesting one where it can actually, it's a negative emotion, but it could actually result in some more positive outcomes depending on how it's operationalized by an organization. Okay. And then I'd say finally, grace. If we can extend grace, it goes a long way. Because again, this can happen to anyone. That's kind of the point I was making earlier. So, and again, I was kind of speaking about these throughout, is avoiding using negative emotions. It's not effective in the long term. It erodes trust. And, I think a lot of times fear is used. It's used because it feels like it has some short-term gain or success. But at the end of the day, you want to build strong communities like religious institutions have done over the years. But if you want long-term success and you want to build that trust, you really need to kind of avoid a lot of these negative emotions. Because when you use these negative emotions, you end up making people feel bad and you erode trust in communities. That's my timer. But you also want to create that sense of belonging. You want people to feel like they're in it together. And I think that's one of the biggest things that it's so easy to forget. We get so wrapped up in this idea that, we need to do more to make our employees comply. We need to do more to make them, not click on that phishing email or not respond to it. we got to remember, it's all of us against the adversaries out there. And we often treat it like it's us against us, you know? And, you know, and it's kind of like, I don't know if I really want to go there, but for religious institutions, it's kind of like, you know, it's like, you know, if you think about a lot of, you know, it's you know, God against Satan or something, you know, whatever the religion is, as opposed to the people within a church, as an example, fighting against themselves. And we see that within some churches or religious institutions, but that's not what's effective, right? And you see how it tears down those types of churches or religious institutions when that's what happens, okay? So happy to take any questions. I know we'll have a mic person too.
I was just going to ask if you would go back to the cyber higher values slide. I didn't catch them all. Leave it there for like 8 seconds. That'd be great.
Sure. Oops. I always went past it myself.
So absolutely phenomenal presentation. Thank you so much. So I have 2 questions. My first question is, what made you kind of draw those parallels between, you know, cybersecurity and religion to kind of come up with, you know, an overarching solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I'd say it's just collaborating with someone and just kind of talking through, like, what are we going to do next that's just kind of out there that hasn't been done? And then trying to just explore and just talk through some things and think about, I don't want to say wacky ideas, but just things that are just kind of out there. And just as an example of that, one thing we started talking about is recently, and it's kind of taken its life of its own, is what can we learn from primates? You know, it's just non-human primates, but what can we learn from, you know, and it's just trying to think about what we're doing is not fully working. And so let's try and take a different direction. And so that was a lot of what has been successful.
So yeah, this is great. And I'm so happy that I found my people, per se, because I've been in cyber. I've been doing it for 24 years. And I've always been of the thought of, you know, so for me, I used to say it's the soft skills of cyber. I did not know there's the human factors. I did not know that there was a coin for it. So it's interesting to see, you know, kind of be gentle, be forgiving, teach, right? Because a lot of people tend to disregard cyber concepts because they just don't know. So where they don't know, they just dismiss. So this is absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
There are a couple dynamics I've observed. One is the admiration the tech press has for the bad guys, quote, the hackers or the adversary, as is from the religious context, the adversary meaning the devil. Right. But that they praise them for their cleverness and ingenuity. Right. And also the second dynamic, what is victim blaming. And I know from working with AERP that there's a great deal of concern and attention paid to the language one uses, that we use with dealing with the victims of fraud and scams, that we don't exalt or, implicitly praise the cleverness of the attacker and focus on the fact that everybody could be a victim, et cetera. But those two dynamics, the victim shaming and the praise of or admiration of the cleverness of the hacker, how would you cut against those dynamics? Because I think I don't see them as helpful in terms of doing our business.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Because I think there's plenty of, there's a certain amount of cleverness that happens at a certain level, but most of the attacks that are occurring isn't coming from clever attackers. It's these opportunistic attacks, or it's from these toolkits that are happening. It's from these people that aren't maybe necessarily clever. They're just bad guys using things that have been developed and doing bad things, right? And they're taking advantage of people that are just doing their day-to-day things, or people that are good people. And when I originally got into this, I never thought I was going to go into cybersecurity. It was my first quarter of my PhD program, and I was trying to work on something entirely different. I didn't get motivated for it at all. And then I just started thinking to the 6 months prior, and my question to myself was, how was it that these perfectly smart, intelligent, reasonable people that I had helped, like friends and family members, over those 6 months prior, had malware infected on their computer? They're not dumb people. They're not unsophisticated people. But it happens to everyone, right? And I don't know the answer to that. But that's what I've been working on ever since, is trying to figure that out. Is because there's something there that, it's not right to try and continually blame these people. But we're trying to figure out what can we do to help them, and I guess shift that conversation a little bit to know that it can happen to anyone. What can we do to try and make it less likely to happen to people, to empower people more, and to, not make people feel bad that it happens to them? But I mean, you asked a great question. I don't maybe have the best answer for it, but it's something that kind of led me down that path.
Again, great talk. I mean, I admit to having some of these ideas myself when I'm studying these beautiful cathedrals throughout Europe. I mean, just gorgeous spaces. Right. And you're looking up and the walls are covered with religious artifacts. And if you're coming from a related religion, at least you can look at it and go, oh, that's the story of so-and-so, and that's the story of so-and-so. And it's this cute retell done around stories. And stories are interesting in religion because they're not like a singular lesson, most of them, right? They're very complicated. They have very deep concepts behind them. And by doing the cued recall, you can do a lot of the things you're talking about, around everything community through shared understanding, many of these aspects. And one of the things that kind of comes up in security is we internally have a lot of stories. So I might say, remember, CrowdStrike, and then half the room goes, yes. And if I did this in, a general group, they'd stare at me, what? Maybe this year they might know, or that thing that took down the airlines, maybe. Instead, what we get the general public is a long list of advice. Please do not, please do not, please do not, please do not. And so I do kind of wonder sometimes what the equivalent would be for us of the type of art you see in cathedrals or going to other spaces, even totem poles, like things that are meant to be a shared point of stories, and kind of how we might, more for the general public than for ourselves, start actually constructing these stories that have lessons and concepts behind them that are linked to imagery, even, that allow for some of this repetition. It's a very complicated question. It
is. If you give me 8 more hours, no, I'm just kidding. But no, I mean, it's a great question. I think that's kind of the next thing, is to think about what some of those stories would look like. And you're absolutely right, is the stories that we would all understand here, be like, oh yeah, is not going to be the same stories that we're going to think about for the average everyday employee, that we really need to communicate that to, that we really need to reach. But we need to consider that, because most of the time we're like, do not, right? And you think about in a lot of Judeo-Christian type of religions where anyone and everyone is a sinner. Well, anyone and everyone can click on that phishing email, right? And how do we reach, how do they reach the people there? How do we reach the people clicking on those phishing emails? And how do we think about telling the stories that are going to be most effective in our organization? It's not going to be talking about CrowdStrike so much, right? It's not going to be talking about, TJ Maxx or whatever so much. But we need to think about it, and we need to be more effective. I know my time is up, but again, thank you so much. It's nice being here. Appreciate it.